No taxation without representation was not the cause of the American Revolution. However, it was important for gaining support early in the resistance. For a decade before there was war, there was an active resistance, and it was mostly centered in Boston. Here's how that story begins. So we've already talked a little bit about the process of Anglicization, the idea that colonists are increasingly buying into the idea of being English, literally buying. They're buying more and more British manufactured goods, and they're actually spending a lot of their money to buy these things, and they're going into personal debt. So we became a debtor nation quite early because these Americans were doing a lot of excessive borrowing. So between 1760 and 1772, personal debt in the colonies doubles from about £2 million to £4 million. And this pushes them, the colonists, into sort of proto-capitalist, right? The desire for more consumer goods that need to be manufactured means that you need to work harder than ever so you can get more products and so that you can get the status that comes with having more of these products, right? So they increasingly become part of what we now call sort of the rat race, where luxuries become necessities, and people want these fashionable, portable, status-bearing goods like embroidered waistcoats, card tables, carved chairs, china plates, silver forks. And it's a way of showing that you are part of that social elite. And you do things that show you're part of the social elite. You drink tea, you dance well, you know how to play different games of skill very well, you know how to dine well, as well as having a strong education. And so here we see an image of someone buying clothes, right? They're going shopping. So this is one of the major questions. If Americans are buying more things and making them more British, why are they revolting? Okay. How do they go from being loyal subjects to an all-out civil war? Well, part of that is that in the aftermath of the French and Indian War, appreciation of British and Britishness starts to change. They start to see that Britain is removing some of their liberties, right? They're forcing them to go into debt through this process, and the British government is forcing the colonists to pay for their protection and prosperity, which seems like a fair trade to Britain, but not so much the colonists, right? And it really all comes down to money. The French and Indian War was a drain on the labor supply. More people had to go fight the French and Indian War, which meant that there were fewer people to do work at home, so poverty spread, right? There was a greater demand for goods, but there was not a lot of supply. So a lot of smuggling increased during the war, and then after the war, there was a recession. So widows are struggling to support their family, work becomes scarce, and so here's a quote on the side. The expense of living in the most frugal way has increased so exorbitantly that I find it beyond my ability to support my family with my utmost industry. I grow every day more and more behind, though my family can scarcely appear with decency or have necessity to subsist. Right? So all of this leads to a little bit of dissatisfaction for the colonists, but it's worse for Britain. Britain also has a huge amount of debt. I had mentioned before that the way that Britain won the French and Indian War was by spending a lot of money. So if we take a look at these tables, up at the top is Britain's debt. Now they had debt, of course, before the French and Indian War to the tune of about £73 million. After the French and Indian War, their debt was £137 million. So to give around numbers, the war cost about £64 million. Now, the interest on the debt, right, because they have to pay interest, you see that in the bottom left, right? The interest on the debt is about 5%. That's a pretty reasonable rate at this time. So the interest on their debt is £6.85 million a year. That's just the interest on the debt. You don't even pay anything down. That's just the interest. And their annual income, what they get in terms of their revenue from taxes and a variety of other things, is about £8 million. Now, that doesn't leave them a whole lot of money for capital improvements or for anything else coming up their way, right? So the cost of the colonies for Britain, if you sort of switch the focus, the cost of the colonies is about £800,000, but they only get about £200,000 in revenue from the colonies. So the colonies cost them every year £600,000. It costs them further into debt. Now, Britain also wants to increase the amount of money they spend on the colonies because they've just gained all this new land and they need more soldiers to deal with the French Canadians and these Native Americans that have been fighting with the Americans. Um, and so they're going to spend even more money. And then they look at the colonists and say, well, why are you only paying £200,000? An average British person in Britain pays 26 times the average colony taxes. So each person in Britain pays 26 times the tax that someone in America pays. And they feel like, the British people feel like, okay, well, maybe Americans should help pay for the protection we give them and for the war that they started. So Britain's plan is to reform the situation to raise more money through the colonists because the Americans don't pay their fair share. And so they're starting to look at the taxes that already exist, right? For instance, one of the taxes, they collected about £1,800, but it cost Britain £7,000 through their custom agents and their salaries to collect it, right? So it's costing them more money to put people to have tax agents out in the field than the money they're getting from collecting those taxes, right? And this is partly because of smuggling and sort of resistance to the British. So they need to change some things. Right, so this is Britain's solution. There's a four-part solution. The first part is to tighten existing laws, right? Stop the violations, right? Stop smuggling. So things like they decide to have the British authorize the Royal Navy to stop ships that they suspect of smuggling, and they can search them at any point, right? You don't need a search warrant. They also want to raise new revenue through taxes. This is not intended to pay British debt, but sort of for the administration of the colonies, right? The idea is let's create the taxes so that they get more revenue. And I'll talk about the sugar tax in a second, which is the Sugar Act, which is the first one in a second. The third is to help the colonists pay by stopping inflation, right? So stop the colonists from printing paper money and force them to use specie, that is gold and silver. And the last is to sort of keep order in the colony by having an army there to make sure that everything goes through. So let's talk about some of these new acts. There's 3 acts that pass in 1764 which fulfill Britain's solutions 2, 3, and 4. And the first one is the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act is actually an act that reduces the tax on molasses, that is sugar that's an import from West Indies, right? The idea is that the sugar tax is too high, right? It's 6 shillings per gallon when it should be 3 shillings per gallon. And because it's 6 shillings, people are smuggling sugar rather than paying the tax. The tax is so high that people aren't paying it. So if you reduce it to 3 shillings per gallon, right, more people will be willing to pay that tax, and then you'll increase the revenue, right? Rather than people cheating and not paying at all, they'll pay something, right? It's not a big tax. Now they also add some new things to be taxed in that, some wine, silk, calico, and coffee. And the colonists immediately start to protest this, right? They say you don't have the right to tax to raise money, and because they say this is going to cause economic hardship. Now, the people who are protesting this are smugglers for the most part because they are going to be undercut by this tax. Right? People are totally willing to pay 3 shillings per gallon rather than 6 shillings per gallon. So the people it causes economic hardship for are smugglers, and then people who will then pay a little bit more for sugar rather than smuggling it. They'll pay for sugar. So 8 colonies start to protest this for economic hardship. Now, along with that comes the Currency Act. The Currency Act says stop printing paper money, you have to use gold and silver. The problem is the colonists don't have gold and silver, right? And any gold and silver they have is immediately sent to England to pay debt, right? So this law makes it much harder to circulate goods, right? The economy would suffer because there's no easy way to trade one item for another without reverting back to bartering. Now, the third part is the Quartering Act, and this is because there are 10,000 soldiers, British soldiers, going to come to America to help protect the Native Americans and to keep the French Canadians in line. right? The Quartering Act says that the troops need to be stationed with the Americans. So the Americans are going to house these soldiers in their own homes, right? And that the colonists have to pay for that, right? So the British are going to send soldiers to the colonists, and the Americans have to house them and they have to feed them, right? They don't like this very much. This is also, they see as economic hardship. All three of those things they follow through on, right? They decide that it seems like an unprecedented step on the part of the British to tax and interfere with the Americans, and they protest, but they basically go along with it. Then comes the stamp tax. This is in 1765, right? The idea is the British say, all right, you have to pay for these soldiers that we're sending, but you have to raise the money to support them, right? If you don't do it, right, within a year, we're going to create this tax. And the tax, it's a very small tax, but it's a tax on every document, newspaper, almanac, playing cards, every piece of paper that's used in the colonies. Right? And the colonists see this as a very dangerous precedent. Right? All of a sudden, Parliament is setting the taxes, and they're doing it for to raise a revenue, right? To raise money, right? And the colonists are like, we're not cash cows, right? You can pass laws to help regulate it, but you can't pass laws to raise money. That's our job. Now, there's three types of reaction to the stamp tax, and it's a huge uproar. There are constitutional arguments, there's economic boycotts, and there's mob action, all three of which have the sole purpose of preventing the stamp tax from going through and convincing Parliament to repeal it. All right, the constitutional argument. Now, this appears in pamphlets, resolves, petitions, and it comes up in two different ways, right? There's two constitutional arguments. The first is about internal versus external taxation. So internal taxation is the idea that you pass a tax to raise money, right? This is just, we're going to put a tax on, say, income, and the whole purpose of that is just so that we have money to operate, right? And the colonists say Parliament does not have the right to do that. Only our local governments have the right of imposing a tax for the sole purpose of raising money. Parliament does have the right for external taxation, which is a law to help regulate. So if you passed a tax to help regulate imports, so for instance, things like cars. In America, we have laws that cars imported from other places have a tax on them versus cars that are manufactured in America don't. And that's a way to protect American automobiles. It used to be the case. So that's a law and a tax that's not about raising revenue. It's about protecting industries, right? It's about regulating trade and regulating manufacturing. That the colonists see as okay. So that's external taxation. They see that is okay. Parliament can do that. But anything that's a tax that's just for raising revenue, that's an internal tax, and Parliament does not have the right to do that. So that's one constitutional argument. And when I say constitutional argument, I mean British Constitution. The other constitutional argument that they have is about virtual versus actual representation. So virtual versus actual representation is the idea that Parliament, so actual representation is the idea that Parliament actually represents people. So this used to be the idea behind, say, Congress, right? That you choose your congressman, and therefore that congressman represents you, right? Now, we do also have what we call virtual representation, which is the idea that you don't actually get to vote for the person, but they're supposed to keep your interests in mind. So think of Puerto Rico's relationship to Congress, right? They don't actually have a voice, a voting voice in Congress, but Congress is supposed to represent their interests in the United States government. So this is an argument the colonists are making, is saying, hey, we want actual representation rather than virtual. And the Parliament is saying, well, lots of people have virtual representation, and that's okay. So this is what Parliament says. It says the merchants of London, the proprietors of the public funds, the inhabitants of Leeds, Halifax, Birmingham, and Manchester, and that great corporation of the East India Company, none of them choose their representatives, and yet they are all represented in Parliament, and the colonies, being exactly in their situation, are represented in the same manner. Right? So they're saying, hey, look, Other people are virtually represented. It's fine. And of course, the colonists do have representation in Parliament. It's just not voting representation. Now, 9 colonies to get together in October 1765 in New York in something called the Stamp Act Congress, in which they agreed to petition the king, restating some of these constitutional arguments. Right? And it comes down to this statement, that it is inseparably essential to the freedom of a people and the undoubted right of Englishmen that no taxes should be imposed on them but with their own consent, given personally or by their representatives. Right? So this is how we get the whole no taxation without representation. Right? But it also comes down to a contradiction. Right? They still see themselves as owing allegiance to Britain, and they want Britain's authority, but yet they deny Britain's very, very practical authority over the colonies. And that's that sort of contradiction which they spend the next 10 years trying to figure it out. Now, Parliament is completely unconvinced by these arguments, but it revokes the Stamp Act in 1766 and instead passes the Declaratory Act, which says Parliament has the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So I say, fine, we'll repeal the Stamp Act, but we still have the right to pass laws at any point. And the people are so happy that the Stamp Act is revoked that they basically ignore it. Now, there are still 2 other ways that the colonists protested the Stamp Act. And I mentioned them not so much because they were so important for the Stamp Act, but because they established the pattern for later protests. So one of the other major ways besides constitutional arguments that Americans protested the Stamp Act was through economic boycott. So what they're doing is there are extra-legal associations who decide, hey, we're going to get together and we're going to all promise not to import anything from Britain, with the idea that we're going to put pressure on Britain. Of course, this doesn't actually work because the colonists are not a big enough market for Britain to even notice. But here we have 2 things. Now, these are both images from later protests, but they show sort of the attitudes towards them. On the left is a non-importation broadside, and this is from Boston in 1770, right? It says, William Jackson, an importer at the Brazen Head, north side of the townhouse and opposite the town pump in Cornhill, Boston, it desired that the sons and daughters of liberty would not buy any one thing of him, for in so doing they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. Right? So this is a way of sort of public shaming someone who may be importing some British goods. Now on the right is an image of what we call the Edison ladies. This is a group of women in North Carolina in 1774, and these are women who decide that they're going to not import things. So these are women merchants, women who are in charge, and they sign an agreement that they're not going to import and they're not going to buy any British goods. And if you look at this image, right, take a look at these women. They're not the best looking women, right? And so this is one of the things, if you look at, well, is this from an American perspective or a British perspective? Are they saying good things about these women or bad things about these women? In general, you could take a look and say, well, look, there's this sort of unfortunate looking woman on the right with the gavel, right? Is that a positive portrayal of her or a negative? It's negative. Well, what about the woman in the middle, right? She's relatively good looking. The implication there, though, is she's sexually promiscuous, right? So that's a negative perspective. And then you have the woman on the far right who looks fine. She's clearly a mother. You see her child down below, who is being licked by a dog who's also peeing, right? She's not a very good mother, is the implication. So this is a commentary on these women. Oh, they're not good women. They're not good mothers, right? This is a negative portrayal. These women who are doing this, this is not good, right? So this is the British making fun of American women who are signing this non-importation agreement. Now, on top of that, there's also what we call mob action. And that's when mobs shout, scream, threaten, intimidate, march to sort of protest the Stamp Act. Now, they do a very sort of successful protest, and it begins August 14th in 1765 in Boston. Now, in the middle of the summer, Bostonians wake to an effigy of Andrew Oliver. He's the stamp collector, and they see a sort of effigy is kind of like a scarecrow, right? It's a sort of mock-up made out of straw. And this effigy of Andrew Oliver is hanging from the Liberty Tree. That's a specific tree in the South End. Thomas Hutchinson, who's the lieutenant governor, the chief justice, and the brother-in-law to Oliver, orders the effigy to be cut down. But the crowd gathers and they absolutely stop him. Now, the crowd eventually does cut down Andrew Oliver, and they take him on a mock funeral parade down to the warehouse where they collect the taxes. They tear down that warehouse, start a bonfire, destroy the property. Then they destroy Andrew Oliver's stable house and coach. They tear up his gardens. They destroy his wine cellar. And even though Hutchinson tries to stop them, they continue. Andrew Oliver gets the message and immediately resigns his position. About 2 weeks later, on August 28th, another mob in Boston attacks and gets the home of Hutchinson. Now, Thomas Hutchinson didn't like the stamp tax, but he believed that everyone should obey the empire. So even though he didn't agree with the stamp tax, because he supported the sort of law and order, he's the one who gets attacked too. And here we see a much later representation, this is from 1774, of tar and feathering of a tax collector named John Malcolm. Now, tar and feathering is not what they use in the stamp tax, but it is a process that colonists use. Now, as I said before, the stamp tax was repealed in 1766, and the colonists celebrate the repeal of the Stamp Act. They're thrilled, right? They sort of ignore the Declaratory Act because the stamp tax worked. And it's sort of a huge amount of support for that. Now, I love this image of the Stamp Act repeal teapot, right? Because they're commemorating the repeal of the Stamp Act on a symbol of British patriotism, right? Teapot is a sign of the British Empire, right? So that they're juxtaposing, just because they're repealing the Stamp Act doesn't mean they don't see themselves as still British. In fact, they see themselves as more British. All of those actions, they enacted their British liberty, right? By protesting sort of this corruption that happened within the government, they were becoming more British than the British, right? If we think about this, this is sort of foreshadowing the revolution. They see themselves as they're expressing their liberty, even as it seems anti-British. Now, things were pretty quiet for a while until about 1770. There are other taxes and other protests, but there's nothing relatively new until 1770. Now, by 1770, there are soldiers everywhere in Boston. They're checking everyone for smuggled items. People are being questioned. There are military parades in the Boston Common. There's loud military music on the Sabbath. And so there's a lot of conflict between the soldiers and the people of Boston, especially between unskilled workers in Boston, the soldiers, because the soldiers tend to moonlight and take jobs from unskilled workers. Now, on March 5th, 1770, a crowd collected on the north end of King Street outside the Customs House. And there's some words exchanged between the Boston crowd and the British sentry. And the Bostonians throw snowballs with chunks of rocks and ice, and they threaten to kill the 8 soldiers there. It's dark. One soldier is hit with a club and responds by firing his weapon. The other soldiers, thinking their commander has given an order to fire, they also fire. So in the end, 4 Americans are killed and a 5th is mortally wounded. Now, the 5 who die are a sailor, a 17-year-old apprentice, a West Indian sailor, an Irish immigrant tailor, and a rope maker. These are regular men, right? This is unskilled people who have the time in the middle of the day, who are not working necessarily, who are getting frustrated with these soldiers. Now, after this, it's all confusion in Boston. The British soldiers are immediately jailed, mostly for their own safety. There's a big procession of the funerals for these 5 men. Now, the soldiers are defended by John Adams. 4 are acquitted, and 2 are charged with manslaughter and have their thumbs branded. But the Boston Massacre is forever immortalized and popularized by Paul Revere's etching, right? But it never really got outside of Boston. And here's a close-up of Paul Revere's etching. And if you take a look at it, right, he's clearly portrayed the soldiers just below the sign Butcher's Hall as deliberate, organized, and almost smiling as they shoot the Americans. On the other side, these Americans, they look very white and they look very elite. You have waistcoats, you have broadcloth coats, you have fancy shoes, right? There's a sense that these are not the rabble that we know, quote, rabble, that we know that they were. These look like elite people. And so Paul Revere is purposely setting them up as setting up the story as a particular version. We know this, and this is the version that became popularized. This is the version that was taught in the school books for a long time. And it was only until the late 19th century when an African American community came together and said, hey, what about Crispus Attucks? One of the 5, the sort of West Indian sailor, was a man named Crispus Attucks, who was probably at least part African American. So here's the first casualty of the American Revolution, and he was African American. And he has become sort of more important, especially in the 1960s, in retelling the story, right? Getting the story a little bit differently than how Paul Revere meant it to be.